Relive the first Olympics, savage competitions where naked athletes often risked their lives, and the victors were honored almost as gods. For the ancient Olympians, winning was everything. These were not polite and gentlemanly contests, exercises in amateur sportsmanship and the modern-day Olympic ideal. The first Olympians fought for tangible rewards. Officially, winners received a symbolic olive crown, but they returned home as conquering heroes and were given extravagant prizes. They competed fiercely for a goal beyond the horizon of most modern athletes, the chance for immortality. There was no afterlife in the Greek religion, and it was only through fame and the glory of some spectacular deed that one could hope to live on, remembered in sculpture and song. To lose, on the other hand, was devastating. There was no silver and bronze in the ancient games. For the losers, no laughter, no triumphant homecoming. They went back to their mothers without delight, creeping through narrow alleys, wrote Pindar, poet of the ancient games. Little remains of ancient Olympia to bring back to life the festivals that once shook these grounds. These crumpled pillars once upheld a majestic shrine to Zeus, in whose honor the games were held. This simple field was the stadion where the track events were held. The grassy slopes teemed with 45,000 spectators. This tunnel once echoed with the footfalls of Olympians entering the field. And overlooking all, high atop this three-sided pillar, stood a winged Nike, goddess of victory, symbol and spirit of the Olympic Games. The origins of Olympia are nearly prehistoric. Humans lived here in this home made of rocks around 2800 BC. Around 1000 BC, Olympia became a shrine to Zeus, god of thunder and lightning. The games themselves evolved from religious rites. The first contest was a foot race to the altar of Zeus, a ritual sacrifice of energy to the god. The first recorded games took place in 776 BC. Incredibly, they continued every 4 years without a single interruption for the next 12 centuries. All Greek citizens could compete. Non-Greeks, whom the Greeks called barbarians, were banned, as were slaves and women. The games were held in August during the full moon. Athletes had to arrive 30 days early for a month of training and scrutiny by the Olympic judges, called the Hellenordiki. If you have practiced hard for Olympia, and if you have not been lazy or done anything dishonorable, they told the athletes, then go forward with confidence. But if any of you have not trained yourselves this way, then leave us and go where you choose. By this time, Olympia was teeming with visitors. 100,000 people from all ends of the ancient world camped out in the fields and olive groves around the shrine. They came by sea and by land. They came from as far away as Egypt, Africa, and Marseille in what today is France, and from Albia on the southern coast of what would become Russia. Often they came from city-states at war with each other. The Greeks in particular were notoriously quarrelsome. But such was the prestige and importance of the games that a 3-month Truce of Zeus, which was inscribed on a sacred discus, protected all travelers to the shrine. Perhaps because it was enforced by the fearsome Spartans, the truce was almost never violated, and the most bitter enemies were able to meet and compete at Olympia in peace. But the first day of the Olympics was not a day of competition. It was a day of religious purification and warning. The athletes were brought here to the Boletarium, the home of the priest. This rock once held a statue of Zeus with his thunderbolt in hand. Under the stern gaze of the god, a priest sacrificed the genitals of a bull as the Olympians took a solemn oath to Zeus to compete fairly and obey the rules. It was an intimidating moment. The penalties for foul play were severe. In the distance, the athletes could see a row of statues called the Zanes, put up to disgrace athletes who had tried to bribe their way to victory. The inscription read, "Not with money, but with speed of foot and strength of body must prizes be won at Olympia." The ancient Greeks deeply appreciated the beauty and art of sport, but they were also shamelessly fascinated with its savagery and violence, which they saw as a metaphor for life.
The Greek word for contest is agon. Our word agony comes from that. The notion of the agon is really central to Greek culture, but particularly in athletics, where agony meant the contest itself contained pain and strife and suffering.
Certainly no sport contains more agony than boxing, which has deep roots in ancient Greece. This elegant fresco of two young boxers was painted nearly 1,000 years before the Olympics began. Boxing was added to the Olympics in 688 BC, followed by wrestling and a vicious new form of fighting called pankration. These three events quickly became crowd favorites, and because of the risk and occasional sacrifice of life and limb, were considered especially pleasing to Zeus. The fights were therefore held in the most sacred part of Olympia, before a 30-foot altar to Zeus made entirely from the ashes of sacrificed animals. A modern boxer would be horrified by the ground rules, or lack of ground rules, that governed an ancient boxing match. There were no weight divisions, there were no rounds. The boxers fought without a break, without water, without a corner man, and without gloves.
They wound leather straps of rawhide leather around their fists and up their arms in order to increase the violence of the blow itself. The leather would actually cut into the skin of the opponent. They would very often land a blow in the head, and there would be blood dripping all over. And they would fight on and on.
When the Romans governed the Olympics beginning in 146 BC, the boxers actually inserted inch-long metal spikes between the straps.
So it was almost more like a knife fight than a boxing match. There were very short careers, and there were either people who were very successful and then a lot of newcomers who kept getting stabbed or actually ruptured by these gloves.
Making matters even more hellish, the fights were held in August in the afternoon under the blazing Mediterranean sun. The boxers had to fight glare, dehydration, and sunstroke along with each other. A fight could last for hours until one boxer signaled defeat, which he did by raising a single finger. But the shame of defeat was so much greater than today that many fighters took a vow to die in the ring rather than lose. Nomalos of Alexandria died here while boxing, this funeral plaque reads, after he prayed to Zeus to give him either the crown or death. The Spartans, fanatically militant and trained never to quit, would not compete in the boxing ring because the disgrace of surrender was so crushing. Fighters were admired not just for the punishment they could inflict, but for the pain they could endure.
They really valued philosophically and physically this notion that you could endure pain to such an extent that you would go on and on receiving blows and enduring the sun and the dust and the heat. And there were philosophical virtues behind it.
Whenever a fight dragged on indefinitely in a stalemate of pure stamina and will, if things seemed hopelessly deadlocked, the judges could call for a climax in which the fighters traded undefended blows.
There is one famous story about two fellows who came to this point in the match, Croegus and Demosthenes. It was a face-off, and they had one blow each. The first blow was to be landed by Demosthenes, and instead of a fist, he used a karate jab and pierced, supposedly, the skin of the opponent, and reached in, gripped his entrails, and tore out his intestines. Croegus, the poor deceased, posthumously was declared victor because of a technicality. They claimed that Demosthenes had not given one blow, but 5, because he used all 5 finger points to pierce his opponent.
The ancient fighters did not have fancy training equipment, but they did have physiques as impressive as their modern counterparts. Boulders like this one, weighing 316 pounds, were used as bodybuilding tools. A weightlifter in the 6th century named Bybon lifted this sandstone over his head, the inscription declares. Boxing may have been the most deadly event, but for extreme wildness, low blows, and dirty tactics, the Pankration was the ultimate spectacle.
The Pankration was an original and very brutal event. It was the most brutal of all the ancient competitions. And some people say it was imperfect boxing combined with imperfect wrestling. You could throw punches, you could kick, you could strangle, you could break bones. Absolutely nothing was barred.
Introduced in 648 BC, the Pankration was governed by only 2 rules: no biting and no gouging, and even those were not always enforced. Conducted in the nude, blows to the genitals were frowned upon, but the rule was frequently ignored. Technique was beside the point in this ancient version of an alley fight, which quickly became the single most popular contest ever in the ancient games.
Pankration, which personifies the violence of ancient sports, was the most appealing, the most popular of all events. And that may tell us something about the human spirit through the ages.
The only relatively civilized combat sport by today's standards was wrestling, although here too the rules were very relaxed.
Generally speaking, it was everything goes, and a lot of things that aren't allowed today. Again, types of strangulation, occasionally breaking bones would be allowed, and tripping was also a good technique.
Highly trained, the ancient wrestlers were well schooled in a vast number of moves: the flying mare, the hammerlock, and various body holds. The matches were held in a pit, and there were 2 forms of competition: upright and on the ground. In the upright, the wrestlers maneuvered around each other on their feet. 3 tosses of any kind meant victory. Ground wrestling was a messy affair held in a mud pit that made the fighters slippery and difficult to hold. As in boxing and Pankration, the match continued until one wrestler signaled defeat. In wrestling, too, the fighting often bordered on the torturous. As early as the 7th century BC, the judges felt the need to make a rule against finger breaking. In the 5th century BC, Leontiscus of Sicily won 2 wrestling competitions in a row by breaking the fingers of all his opponents. The Greeks liked to mix danger, sometimes extreme danger, with sport. Bull jumping was a popular event in Crete 2,000 years before the birth of Christ, with acrobats literally grabbing the horns of an onrushing bull and somersaulting over his back. During the Olympics, the riskiest sport was the chariot race. Deep beneath this wild olive grove lie the remains of the Hippodrome, the chariot racing track at Olympia, swept away when the Alpheus River suddenly changed course around 600 AD. The track was 150 yards long and had room for 44 chariots, each one pulled by 4 horses. Along the sides and on either end sat tens of thousands of frenzied Greeks. The race was a harrowing test of skill and nerve, a 24-lap, 5 1/3 mile free-for-all with over 160 horses.
The most difficult point in the course is when they would come to the turning post. That meant that you had to pivot the chariot 180 degrees in absolutely no distance. And literally, the chariot itself would spin around the corner. Naturally, there were lots of wrecks at the corners. Chariots turning over, guys flying out, horses tripping over each other.
Making the race absurdly risky was the fact that there was no divider separating lines of traffic. Deadly collisions were frequent. According to the poet Pindar, in one race, 43 of the 44 chariots crashed. The winner was the only one to survive the field. Zeus ruled Olympia, but for the charioteers there was another god of great importance, the god of horses, whose statue overlooked the track.
His name was Taraxippus. He was the horse disturber. So naturally, you'd give lots of offerings to Taraxippus before you would start your chariot race.
The one point of order in this racing mayhem came at the start. The Greeks devised an ingenious mechanism to guarantee fairness out of the gate. It featured a bronze eagle that rose above the crowd and triggered the race. The chariots themselves were small two-wheelers, open at the back with 4 spokes to a wheel. The driver stood, exposed above the knees. This statue of a charioteer holding the reins was found at Delphi, where the Greeks competed in games almost as prestigious as the Olympics. The Greeks prized poise and control in the midst of violence and chaos, and this figure captures that ideal. Women were not allowed to compete as charioteers, but they could enter teams of horses they had trained. This pedestal once held the statue of a victorious princess from Sparta.
Kings of Sparta were my fathers and brothers. Cainista, victorious at chariot races with her swift-footed horses, erected this statue. I assert that I am the only woman in all Greece who won this crown.
Like today, boys were often used as jockeys in the horse races that followed the charioteers. Again, the drama of the race was the tension between wildness and control. The jockeys rode bareback with neither saddle nor reins, guiding their steed with their knees and prodding them with whips. The horses were often wild. In 512 BC, a mare named Breeze threw her jockey as she bolted out of the gate, ran the race riderless, and won. The games weren't the only reason people came to Olympia. They also came to see and be seen. Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato were all here mingling with the throng. Herodotus, the world's first professional historian, made his reputation here, reading his work from the back of the Temple of Zeus. People also came here for the art that embellished this legendary shrine. First-time visitors must have been overwhelmed by what they saw. These bases once supported thousands of works of art, a forest of statues, in the words of one writer. Only a handful have survived, masterpieces pulled from the rubble a century ago. Sadly, nothing remains of the legendary statue of Zeus housed in his temple, a statue that was counted among the 7 wonders of the world.
An enormous amount of gold and ivory went into the making of this statue. All of the flesh parts were of ivory. The throne was partly ivory, partly ebony, partly jewels. All of Zeus's drapery was of gold, gold leaf. was amazing.
Surrounding the statue and decorating the inner temple were dozens of lion's head spouts. Outside of the temple, monumental sculptures laid out scenes from Greek mythology. Adding to the dazzle of the shrine, many of the buildings were painted with brilliant colors and intricate designs. This ruin, surrounded by 182 pillars, was the Leonidian, an elite hotel for the super-rich. Of the 100,000 visitors to the Games, only 50 were housed here at a time. The Olympians practiced here in the Palestra, where they boxed and wrestled, and in the gymnasium where they trained for the most prestigious of the ancient games, the pentathlon. If the chariot showed the Greeks at their most fearless and frenzied, the pentathlon represented the other pole of the Olympic ideal: balance, grace, and all-around skill.
The event had a certain idealism to it. The Greeks were concerned with proportion and balance in the individual. And I think we see this in the athlete who emerges from the pentathlon.
It was the pentathlete whom ancient sculptors used as models when they chiseled the bodies of the gods. The Greeks valued proportion immensely, and the winner of the pentathlon was considered the greatest athlete of the games. Pentathletes competed in 5 very different and stylistically demanding events: running, jumping, discus, javelin, and wrestling. Technique and timing were crucial to them all, and the contestants spent years in the gymnasium training rhythmically to the accompaniment of a flute. The events differed from today in interesting ways. In the javelin, for example, the Greeks used a loop in the middle of the spear to put extra thrust into their throw. They threw a heavier discus that weighed as much as 15 pounds, 3 times the modern weight. Perhaps that's why they perfected a twist and release technique that has survived to this day. The most dramatic and intriguing difference was in the long jump, where the Greeks carried 5 to 15-pound hand weights called halteres, which they used to add momentum to their jumps.
It seems absurd to carry weights when you're trying to jump farther, but in fact, you can use the impetus of actually throwing the weights to literally pull you through the air, and you can feel yourself being dragged forward by the inertia of these weights. It really does add length to your jump.
Incredible length, apparently. The jumping pit in which the Olympians competed allowed for 50-foot jumps, more than 20 feet longer than the modern world record. From a modern point of view, nudity is certainly the most startling aspect of the ancient Olympic Games. All of the events, running, discus, wrestling, and the rest, were held in the nude. How did this custom develop? According to one story, the transition came in the year 720 BC, when a runner named Osippus lost his loincloth in mid-race. When he won the race, all the runners decided to run naked, and the practice eventually spread to the other events. Modern scholars dismiss this explanation and point out that nudity and homosexuality were neither shameful nor uncommon in Greek society. The very word gymnasium, where Greek citizens were educated, comes from the word for nude.
In the 600s BC, gymnasia were invented, the buildings of exercise. And also at this time, homosexuality became very important and out of the closet, as it were, for the Greeks. And at that point, nudity was also introduced into the games. There is no inherent connection, but it's my thesis that these things all contributed to one another in Greek society.
Homosexuality was not shunned at all in ancient Greece, and in fact it was encouraged because The important thing for a man to do was marry a virgin and produce children. The only way to keep virgins was the practice of homosexuality, and so it was encouraged. I think the atmosphere at Olympia must have been extremely electric. These men were the best of their city-states. They were the most handsome, they were the best trained, and there was also sexual attraction between them.
Also, presumably, between the men and the women who were allowed to watch the nude games. Curiously, married women were strictly forbidden from watching the games or even crossing the Alpheus River that bounded the sanctuary. The penalty for breaking this rule was death. Women caught in the sanctuary were thrown off a cliff that overlooked the shrine. But female virgins were allowed to watch the games, despite the nudity and the brutality of the combat sports.
Unmarried girls, that is, maidens, were allowed in because they were still, in some sense, wild. And also, they had to get used to the idea of men being a part of their life. And what better introduction than to show them men performing completely naked?
One modern commentator said that it was because married women should not see what they don't have, and young virgins should look at the cream of the crop, the best Greek men that there were, because this is what they want to aim for.
The virgins were allowed to compete in their own games as well, called the Heraia, in honor of Hera, wife of Zeus. The Heraia consisted of 3 sprints, one each for girls, teens, and young women, covering the length of the Olympic track. Actually, the track was shortened by 1/6 to match the shorter stride of the girls. Spartan girls, trained athletically from birth like boys, dominated the games. Unlike the men, the women did not compete in the nude, but wore a short tunic called a chiton that exposed the right breast.
The women's events were a ritual activity, a kind of public demonstration of their value and their spirit before they were tamed in marriage, before they would become women. It was a rite of passage.
The women's races were held on a day of rest for the men, a day of ritual feasting that brought to a climax the religious side of the ancient games. No trace remains of the altar of Zeus that once stood here, between the temple of Zeus and the temple of Hera.
It would be a visual representation of the high honor in which Zeus was held. The more sacrifices he has, the more honor he has. And here, standing in front of you, is a visual reminder of how many sacrifices have been awarded to this deity.
Mixed with water and hardened into shape, a stairway was cut into the side of the ashy mound so that the priests could make new burnt offerings. At high noon on the 3rd day of the games, the sacrifice was spectacular. An entire herd of bulls, 100 in all, killed and burned in honor of Zeus. Actually, only a small and symbolic part of each animal was allotted to the god.
They'd take some of the most useless parts of the animal, and they would put them on the altar, and they would burn those for the gods. 99% of the animal then was butchered and cooked. And then in the evening, everyone would get a piece. The meat would be distributed to the crowd, and it would be a great occasion.
A still greater occasion came the next morning when the men's foot races began. As the first Olympic event, the races had special meaning for the Greeks, who named each Olympiad after the winner of the stayed race, or single-length sprint. The stadion track looked much as it does today. The starting line had grooves in which the runners could fit their toes. The distance to the finish line was 600 feet, said to be the length Hercules, the mythical founder of the games, covered in a single breath. On the slopes to either side, room for 45,000 roaring spectators, many of whom camped and cooked on the grass during the night. Interestingly, they watched bareheaded in the burning August sun. Wearing a hat was forbidden in the stadion because it might obstruct someone's view. Despite the enormous wealth and prestige of the games, seats or benches were never built into the sides of the hills in the manner of other stadions. The Greeks wanted to preserve the ancient democratic tradition of sitting on the grass. The only seats were 12 stone thrones in the center for the Hellenordiki, or judges, and this single seat on the other side reserved for the only married woman allowed into the stadion, the priestess of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, who was once worshipped at Olympia before Zeus. As many as 20 runners would compete on the stadion track. They drew positions by lot, and a herald called them to their posts one at a time. Clean starts were strictly enforced, and for centuries, runners who jumped early were beaten by the judges with rods. In the 4th century BC, however, the Greeks invented a starting mechanism called the hisplex, which used a bar in front of the runners to guarantee a fair race. One of the most striking differences between the ancient runners and modern Olympians was the starting stance.
The stance for the beginning of the race looks very odd to us, but you have to understand the setup and the mechanism. When the bar dropped, his arms would go down, his body would go forward, his toes would push out of the grooves, and he would get pretty good purchase for a head start into the stadium.
There's no way of knowing how fast the Greeks ran. They never measured any of their events or competed against the record. For the Greeks, the essence and meaning of sport was in the man-to-man duel, the agon or agony of a contest. Legends of speed do, however, abound. Vladis of Sparta either jumped or flew over the stadion, one statue base reports. His speed was phenomenal and impossible to relate. In addition to the one-link stayed race, the Greeks also ran the double stayed up and down the track, and the dalikos, a 2.25-mile run 20 times around the track. Ironically, the famous relay race in which teams passed a torch was not part of the Olympic Games. Neither was the marathon, although the Greeks relied on running as a method of communication and were phenomenal distance runners. Immediately after winning the dalikos in 328 BC, a runner named Aegeus ran from Olympia to his home in Argos, a distance of 60 miles in a single day. The last race of the day was most unusual, an exhausting test of speed and strength in which Greek foot soldiers known as hoplites raced 2 times up and down the track in full armor.
If you can imagine running with 50 pounds of armor for 400 meters at top speed and making a turn, it was a tremendous event. The interesting thing about the hoplite race is that it comes at the very end of the Olympic Games. It signaled the end of the Olympic peace interval and the return to hostilities, which were the sad fact of most Greek life. It was a reminder that all the beauty of the Games was about to end and a different kind of excitement was about to overtake their lives.
For more than 1,200 years, the greatest athletes of the ancient world came to compete at Olympia. The winners received nothing more than an olive branch cut from a tree in the same spot as this one behind the temple of Zeus. But when they returned home, they were showered with gifts. Free meals for life in Athens, along with a stipend for each victory worth $110,000. They were worshipped as heroes and even as gods. Olympians personified the Greek ideal of arete, of striving for excellence. Even their sweat, the symbol of that striving, was revered. The
sweat of the athlete was actually a very prized commodity They would scrape the sweat combined with the dust of their competition, and they would preserve it and put it in bottles, and it would be sold as a magical potion.
This stone preserves the names of Olympian winners. Unfortunately, no statues remain of the true legends of the games, like Milo of Croton, a wrestler who won 6 consecutive Olympic crowns. So feared was he in his prime that all of his competitors once dropped out of the games and conceded defeat, beaten by his reputation. His strength was said to be superhuman. Ancient sources report that Milo once carried a full-grown bull around the stadium, then butchered it and ate it in a single day. Another Olympian known for incredible strength was Polydamas of Scortuzza, who won in 408 BC, but was just as famous for his feats outside the games. Polydamas was said to have fought and killed a full-grown lion with his bare hands, and stopped a speeding chariot by grabbing the rear with a single hand. Among runners, the most successful was Leonidas of Rhodes, said to possess the speed of a god. He won 3 races in each of 4 consecutive Olympiads, and was literally worshipped as a god in Rhodes. But the single most astonishing Olympic feat, if it is to be believed, belongs to a jumper named Phailos, who competed in the 110th Olympiad.
According to the ancient stories, the jumping pit itself was a length of 50 feet. This is incredible to us because the modern jump is just a few inches over 29 feet, and Phailos is said to have jumped beyond the jumping pit, something like 55 feet, and landed with such force that he broke both of his legs.
The jump of Phailos is nothing compared to the long jump through time of the Olympics themselves. That remarkable history is reflected in this sanctuary. This circular monument, the Philippion, was built by King Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander the Great after they defeated the Greeks in 338 BC. They built this memorial in the heart of Olympia as a show of power. The Romans did likewise 2 centuries later, placing 21 gold shields around the top of the Temple of Zeus after turning Greece into a Roman province. Olympia was now a centerpiece of Roman greatness, and Rome did much to renovate and maintain the shrine, building an aqueduct that carried water 10 kilometers to this once elegant reservoir. They also built a bathhouse and an unusual club for athletes, excavated by German archaeologists only last year.
The members must be winners in the Olympic events. And this is the building for the winners in the Olympic events. All this was had marble plaques on the floor. Even the walls were ornamented with marble plaques, and this basin, water basin, you can see some rest of the marble plaques. We have evidence by ancient sources that such guilds existed. And the most important, the winners in Olympia. It was the upper class athlete guild.
The clubhouse was built by Nero, who believed he was a god and competed in the chariot races in 67 AD. Driving a chariot drawn by 10 horses, Nero was thrown from the cart and couldn't finish the race. Nevertheless, he was declared the winner. When Nero died a year later, his victory was overturned. When and how did the games finally end? Until recently, it was believed that the last Olympiad was held in 393 AD, when Theodosius I, the Christian emperor of Rome, shut down all pagan shrines. 30 years later, his son Theodosius II supposedly finished the job, burning the shrine and the Temple of Zeus in 426 AD. But Professor Sin and his colleagues have uncovered evidence that the games continued for another century, until 500 AD. They found their evidence on a plaque that had fallen into the bottom of an ancient latrine.
At the bottom of this toilet channel, we found one piece of this large plaque. It was written in different manners by 14 athletes. All of them are Olympic winners. The latest one in the very, very end of the 4th century AD. So we learn by this inscription that the history of Olympia is to be added by 120 years.
The ancient games finally vanished along with Olympia itself when 2 earthquakes swallowed it at the start of the 5th century. A small Christian village eventually sprang up around the ruins, and a church was built from the only surviving building, the workshop of the great sculptor Phidias, where the legendary statue of Zeus had been carved. By the 6th century, that too had vanished, buried by floods that put all of ancient Olympia under 20 feet of dust and mud, where it remained for the next 1,300 years. The first modern excavation took place in 1829. German archaeologists took over in 1875 and have been unearthing ruins ever since. The work is so painstaking and expensive that the stadion itself was not dug out until the 1960s. The hippodrome is buried beneath these groves and would be so enormously expensive to dig out, it will probably never be salvaged. But the site is very much alive, as are the Olympic Games, revived in 1896 as the ancient ruin was coming dramatically back to life. The Olympic flame that burned here for 1,200 years is once again lit in the stadium and carried by runners to the site of the upcoming Games. Proof of the undying past that is forever with us on our journey in search of history.